Hello, I'm Dr. Bridget Nash, and I'd like to welcome you to The Therapy Show, a podcast series that seeks to demystify mental health treatment. Today, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Lawrence Shulman, who is Professor Emeritus and former Dean of the University at Buffalo School of Social Work. As a social work practitioner educator for more than 40 years, Dr. Shulman has done extensive research on the core helping skills that are used in social work practice, child welfare, school violence, and supervision best practices. Dr. Shulman is the co-founder and co-chair of the International and Interdisciplinary Conference on Clinical Supervision, sponsored by the National Institutes of Health and Hawthorne Press. Recognized for his dedication to excellence in scholarship and research, pedagogy and curriculum development, and organizational leadership, Dr. Shulman is a recipient of the 2014 Significant Lifetime Achievement in Social Work Education Award, conferred on him by the Council on Social Work Education. Dr. Shulman has published numerous journal articles on the topic of direct practice and is the author of many books, including the enhanced 8th edition of the Empowerment Series, The Skills of Helping Individuals, Families, Groups, and Communities, The Dynamics and Skills of Group Counseling, and the 4th edition of the seminal book, Interactional Supervision. Dr. Shulman, welcome to The Therapy Show.
Good afternoon, Bridget. I'm pleased to be on your show.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about your personal and professional background and how it informed your interest in social work supervision?
Well, I started out at 16 at City College, first person in my family to go to a college. And I took a CUDA preference test while at City College, and it told me when they analyzed it that I should be a social worker. I told them that was ridiculous. Social workers just did welfare work, and I wasn't going to do that. I then went to summer camp to work as a waiter under a guy named Mel Herman, who had an agency for children and adults who were physically disabled. He was an extremely positive influence on me. And when I finished college, it took me 6 years, by the way, to get through City College because I had a great time. I was only 16 and I flunked many of my courses the first 2 years. But he got me into Columbia University by suggesting they take me as a risk student. So my start in supervision was as a camp waiter, and my start in social work was as a camp waiter. And then later on, after I graduated with my MSW, I did teaching at Rutgers University, and I had a field unit in an institution. And that's where my interest in supervision really grew. I also had the opportunity to work in a workshop with Bill Schwartz, who was teaching at Columbia at that time. And so Bill Schwartz had a very powerful influence on me as well. And I always like to acknowledge his contribution to my work. So that's how I began, by accident. I wasn't even going to go to college until I was walking down the back flight of stairs at my high school, and somebody stopped me and told me City College was free. So it was really quite a path that ended up taking me into social work, into teaching, into supervision, and into the practice over the last number of years.
That's an incredible story. On the topic of supervision, how does someone become a supervisor?
Unfortunately, people are often promoted into positions from frontline without preparation that focuses on supervision practice. The training they get often focuses more on management issues, not on process that is important because of the parallel process. In my work, in my book, in my other work, and my research, I believe that as a supervisor works with a staff member, frontline social worker, for example, whether they like it or not, they're always modeling how to be effective with someone else. So if they're not modeling effective practice with their staff, why should they expect the staff to be able to do it with their clients? And so this parallel process has been very important in my work over all of these years, trying to focus on what it is that a manager can do for a supervisor, for example, that helps that supervisor become more effective with frontline staff and in turn more effective with clients. And my research shows that that is the way it works. You can't expect someone to work effectively with clients if you're not working effectively with them.
What is the difference between consultation and supervision?
Well, there's a basic difference. A consultant often lacks the agency's granted authority that a supervisor has. Content can be similar. The 4 areas of supervision that I see in both supervision and consultation, including things like job management, That means how do you manage your job, get your records done on time, come in on time, etc. Professional impact. How do you work with other professionals? Continued learning. How do you continue to learn all of your professional life? Because I don't think you ever really stop. In fact, I think if you stop, you go backwards. And direct practice. You can get consultation in any of those four areas. Consultation is really often voluntary. Whether you take it or not is another issue. Supervision does have authority, and therefore one has to be more tuned to the supervisor's point of view and implementing that point of view. So I would say consultation is more informal. Supervision has the impact of the authority of the agency. Peer consultation can be helpful, but someone needs to have the role and the authority to make the consultation work. It's amazing how peer groups are brought together and everyone thinks because they're all peers, they're going to be able to work effectively with each other. That's not my experience, and it's not my research. Right now, I'm having a project with one of the schools of social work on disconnected field students, the impact of the virus and closing down of agencies, lack of supervision has been very powerful. So the project I'm working on with the school is to help advanced second-year students lead support groups for students who are disconnected from their agency. Again, they're peers, but the peer group leader has a special responsibility, and I will be doing some training so they can do their job well. Individual and group supervision, individual supervision is often one-on-one. Group supervision is when a staff member or supervisor meets with a group of staff. And I think I can get into that in a little more detail later on.
So many supervisors are working hard to provide good supervision, often in difficult circumstances. Can you share a few best practices or quick steps that they can easily incorporate into their work as supervisors?
My background originally when I went to school of social work was group work. That's what we used to have. You did casework, group work, or community organization, or administration. There wasn't such a thing as generic practice. One of the things that I developed in my own work, and Bill Schwartz really contributed to that, was the idea of mutual aid. That people who have similar problems, similar issues, similar concerns can often be more helpful to each other than the outsider, the social worker, or the person with authority can be to them. Also, the idea that giving help gets help. So as you help someone else, you're really helping yourself. So I believe group supervision is one of the models that can be helpful. Now, it's a little complicated these days because of the impact of the virus and the ability or inability to have the individual consultations. But I think work can be done online using Zoom, in which people can all be participating at the same time. I think the kind of support you get, for example, when you discover you're all in the same boat, you're all struggling with similar issues, that could be even more helpful than anything you might get from a supervisor directly. I had a Zoom meeting today just before this with a bunch of people who were managers, heads of agencies right across the country. And what was clear was that they were under tremendous stress. And so one of the important things I tried to do this afternoon is point out how they had to make sure that they got support from each other in the group and individually in order for them to be able to provide that support.
Some social workers report that they are getting little or inadequate supervision. What guidance do you have for them to help address this problem?
It's, by the way, not just some social workers. It's more social workers than you would believe because I do a lot of research and I've done questionnaires with thousands of social workers over the years, and many of them feel they're not getting enough supervision. I think it depends on why this is happening. For example, if you're a supervisee, have you asked your supervisor for more support? Do they talk about their practice with their colleagues? Does the agency simply not value supervision? If that's really it, the agency doesn't value supervision, they don't provide time for supervisors to provide the support that you need. My advice, especially in certain times, is you might need to change jobs because I don't think you could do ongoing direct practice work without the support and the help from a supervisor who cares about you as much as they care about the clients.
Can you talk about the ethical and legal issues social workers must consider, both as a supervisor and as a supervisee?
Well, I'm not an expert in the area of ethics. You've had speakers on that I think are expert areas. But the NASW Code of Ethics specifically addresses supervision. And interestingly enough, most of the elements that they address parallel the code for ethical practice. For example, confidentiality is an important issue both in practicing with clients and in supervision. But in both cases, if others are at risk because of the things you hear as a practitioner or as a supervisor, you are required to report it. Now, each state has its own laws that need to be understood by the supervisor and the supervisee. So I think it's important to review the NASW Code of Ethics. I think it's important for a supervisor as they work with new workers, for example, to go over what are some of the ethical issues that are problematic and that they have to pay attention to. And maybe most important, I think they have to create the conditions where a new worker can raise issues that they're troubled by as they work with clients and get some help. Because some of these things are borderline, and the question about whether or not you need to say report someone or not report someone, contact child welfare, not contact, they can be difficult to decide. And so I think conversation is important. But again, the parallels are there.
So what are the one or two most common or costly errors supervisors make?
Well, the one that I see most often, I do a lot of supervision workshops where I'm meeting with groups. Sometimes they're small, 10 maybe in an agency, or the largest group I had was 1,400 at NYU, the field instructors for the 5 schools of social work at that time. And one of the things that comes up most often is that they start to answer the worker's question before they know the question. For example, a worker might come by an open door of a supervisor. And I've had this happen. I have this raised in my workshops. And they say something like, look, what do I do about this terrible client? They won't respond. And I think it's time for me to stop seeing them. Now, they'll say that right in the doorway, never mind in a conference. And a supervisor who responds quickly, because the supervisor is harried, the supervisor is often overwhelmed as well, and simply says, look, they're not going to be responsive. We should just cut them off. I don't think the supervisor has really taken the time to understand the meaning of that question. If they're too busy right now, they might say, come in tomorrow morning and let's talk about it. But I think what they have to do is they have to explore the process. They have to say things like, wow, sounds like you just had a tough interview with him. Sit down. Tell me a little bit about the interview. What was going on? What was it about the interview that you think created this tension or the stress or his resistance? So if I had to come to one single thing, most costly error is providing the answers to a question before you know the meaning of the question.
In your book, Interactional Supervision, you describe the practice of parallel process. Can you talk a bit about how that works?
Well, there's a lot of work going on right now about evidence-based practice. The field is quite interested in it. Schools of social work are integrating it. Most of the models, by the way, come from fields other than social work. And I think that's one of the problems with it, but that's another issue I won't get into right away. But what I think we've noted over the years is that some of the evidence-based practice, the way it's taught anyway, it can be mechanical in the way it gets implemented. The worker learns more, I think, about what the supervisor really thinks and feels about practice by the way the supervisor supervises them. For example, a supervisor who is critical of a worker because the worker in a conversation with a client or a family, whatever, appeared to lack empathy with the client. But at the exact same time, the supervisor is not empathizing with the worker, then you're modeling the opposite of what you would like the worker to do. So the parallel process really says that every level has to practice in their own functional role. Supervision is not clinical practice or therapy, but the process of supervision, the developing of a working relationship, getting the sense that the person you're supervising thinks you care about them, not just care about the work. All of those are very important. So in my research, I have found a parallel process that's central to my whole view that in effect, from the top to the bottom, the way in which you work with people in the next level models for them, like it or not, how they ought to work with the level that they deal with. Managers with supervisors, supervisors with frontline workers, and workers with parents, for example. As the worker works with the parent, the worker is modeling how a parent often has to deal with the child and the family. A worker who has very little empathy for the parental problem and identifies with the kids is modeling the opposite of what that parent has to do when they deal with their children. So the parallels exist, and I think the parallel process is probably the most central and most important part of the work that I've done over these years.
I remember spending a lot of time in my 20-hour supervision course on cultural competence. Can you explain why it is important for supervisors to demonstrate cultural competence when serving in a supervisory role?
The areas that I like to look at, I call inter and intra-cultural interaction. And what are the underlying dynamics? Inter means you're working with someone who's different from yourself. For example, it could be race, it could be gender, it could be sexual orientation. I could go on. It could be socioeconomic class. Intra is when you're working with someone who is like yourself. Let's say, for example, an African-American social worker working with an African-American client, or a Hispanic social worker working with a Latino. I think there are underlying dynamics there. And one of my complaints or one of my concerns is that a lot of teaching in schools of social work and a lot of supervision focuses on cultural issues. Let us understand the culture of this group better so we can be more helpful. Nothing wrong with that. I think it's important, for example, to understand family culture that might be in a Latino family in some parts of the country. It might be different in California than it is different from Texas or from Florida. So I'm not objecting to that. But that is not a substitute for taking a look at the process that goes on between the worker and the client. And that's where I think there is generally a failing. For example, I had an African-American frontline worker in one of my workshops. It was on child welfare. And he was dealing with a white family, Caucasian family in South Boston. In those days, and probably even now, South Boston was essentially a white enclave with very few people of color living in it. And there were many attitudes and values in South Boston that I would consider to be racist. So this worker is working with this family and is reaching out because there's been a complaint. He wants to make sure that everything is okay. And as the mother responds to the worker, she calls him sir. The father looks at the mother and says, you don't have to call him sir. Now, I want you to imagine, as the father says that 2 or 3 times, how that impacts that protection, that child welfare worker of color, as he keeps saying, you don't have to call him sir. When he raised this in the workshop, I asked him, did you say anything to him? Because it must have felt terrible, and it did feel terrible for him. He knew exactly what this guy was saying about him. I said, did you say anything to him? He said, no, I didn't. I said, well, what came out of your conversation about this when you discussed it with your supervisor? He said he didn't discuss it with his supervisor. Why not? My supervisor is white. And that was a big issue, not just in that agency, but in many of the agencies that I had been working with. That if you don't deal with the intercultural issue between the supervisor and the worker, how do you expect the worker to feel comfortable raising intercultural issues in their practice? Cultural issues or intra is a little bit different. Intra is when they're the same. So when you have a worker, if you're, for example, a Native American supervisor and you have a Native American worker and you've just been promoted to the position and the worker says to you, well, I'm glad I have you as a supervisor because those white supervisors around here, they don't have any idea about what goes on with us and our families and our culture. That's an effort to make an arrangement between the worker and the supervisor based on their intracultural issues. I think that's just as big a problem as there is with the intercultural and probably gets less attention in the agency. So I hope I've made that clear. In both cases, I'm interested in the process, what goes on in the conversation. Sure, we need to know about the culture. That's wonderful. I think it's important to understand as deeply as it can the culture of the other person. But I think you also have to address, how do I work cross boundaries? In many cases, a client in one population group will not raise the issue if they feel that the worker in the other population group just doesn't understand them. I think it's important for things like that to be put right on the table so that, for example, a worker might say to a client, I come from a different community. It might be hard for me to fully understand how you and your family experienced this. Can you explain it to me? That would be, I think, a terrific intervention. And why not have a supervisor do the same with the worker? I've got examples in the book where exactly that's what happens. And that opens up the issue of intercultural interaction and allows it to become legitimate, not a taboo discussion area.
I think that's very important. As a social work supervisor, it can be challenging to work in the field as a clinical social worker and then transition into the role of supervisor. Do social work supervisors need their own supervision or consultation?
Absolutely. In the Canadian research I did a number of years, I was teaching at the University at British Columbia in Vancouver. And I managed to do a research project privately funded by a foundation in which I looked at 5 levels of the child welfare system in British Columbia. Not the entire system, but about half of it. So I had executive directors who were responsible for regions of the province. I had managers who had specific areas they were responsible for. Supervisors who worked under those managers in various areas of the region. Those supervisors had frontline workers who worked with family members who had kids. 5 levels. It was a major study. And I looked at every level. And I designed questionnaires and ways of getting data where I looked at some of the same issues up and down the 5 levels. And my results were pretty clear. And they showed that the way in which each level worked with the level below them had a profound impact on the way the level below them worked with the level that they worked with. So, for example, if supervisors were supportive and empathic with workers, if workers could say in the questionnaire, my supervisor understands how I feel, my supervisor is supportive, things like that, then you found clients said the same thing about the workers. I want to underline that. It's not every client and it's not every relationship, but there was a significant correlation. The way in which, for example, the executive director supervised the manager got carried over into how the manager supervised the supervisor and how the supervisor supervised worker, right down to the kids in the study. So yes, I think supervisors need support. They need supervision, but so do managers. They need some areas of support as well if they're going to provide it to their supervisors.
So everybody benefits.
You bet. And I think another thing I'd like to add is I don't think it ever ends. I think if you stop looking at your work, if you stop analyzing and considering the process that goes on between you and the people you work with, you actually go backwards. So even if you have developed skill, the fact that you are no longer at least taking some time to think about the way in which you supervise or practice or manage means that under the stress of day-to-day operations, especially now, my God, with what's going on because of the impact of the cutbacks, people losing their jobs, people fearful, working at home, having to wear masks, this is really a terrible time that's happening. We don't even know how long it's going to continue at this stage. So if you're not constantly looking at your work, I think you're losing whatever skills and whatever development you've developed along the way. So the answer is yes.
What do social workers do if they are being asked by their supervisors to perform a task that they feel is against the NASW Code of Ethics or a current law?
Again, this comes from my experience of working with supervisors groups or direct practice groups in workshops and consultations over quite a few years. My first question really would be, have they raised it directly as a concern? In other words, have they sat down with their supervisor or their manager and said, look, I have a concern about this, that this thing that you're asking me to do right now may be a violation of the Code of Ethics. And, it's borderline at best. They need to raise it directly. And if they don't get an appropriate response, or in fact, they get criticized for it or threatened because of it, then I think the next step is to take a look at the National Association of Social Workers, NASW, state chapter, and the state's commission on ethical practice. I believe they need to, even though it's risky, and I understand why they're hesitant, I believe our code of ethics requires us not to implement an unethical practice. And if it's going on in our agency, we can be gentle when we raise it. We can try to raise it in a non-critical way and in a responsive and supportive way. But if the agency is practicing unethically, somebody needs to know about it. And I understand it's a risk that people have to take, but that comes with professional responsibility.
So learning how to document correctly can be a daunting task for new social workers. Isn't it critical that supervisors spend some time with their supervisees and actually teach them how to document correctly?
Yes, but I would raise the question, what kind of documentation is needed? Much of the documentation that people do have to do with case management and other issues. Very rarely are supervisees taught or expected to do some kind of a process recording. Now, I hope process recordings haven't completely gone out of fashion in schools of social work. They were on their way when I used to teach about 10 years ago. But I think some process needs to be included in the documentation. I developed a 2-page example where a social worker can pick a case, for example, a difficult case, one they're having trouble with. And maybe when they come into the next session or before the session, they hand in a 2-page thing. And what does it do? That 2-page has a paragraph at the beginning, which has a little process. What does that mean? What I said to the client, what the client said back. How did I feel at that moment? It might be just a paragraph. And then there might be some summary. And then the worker might take a portion of that conversation or a portion of the group meeting or the family session, expand it to a paragraph with a little more process, a little more summary, and then the ending in process. I believe how sessions begin and how they end are very important. And so if I'm supervising someone and I want to help them on how they actually work with clients, I want to see a little of that in process. Now, that's a 2-page document. I'm not talking about the process recordings I was required to do when I was a first-year student, which ended up running 20 pages because they were almost word for word. I'm talking about a very brief but clear document that helps my supervisor get a better understanding of what I'm experiencing in a session with a client and my feelings during that process and my questions about that session. That's a daunting task as well, but I think supervisors, if they spend some time with this supervisor, you can teach them how to do that. I think you're hearing a theme throughout my presentation all through this, and that theme is more attention to the process of practice and supervision is crucial. We can't just talk about the client. We can't just talk about the policy. We have to get into some detail, not everything, but some detail of what went on between the worker and the client, how they felt, some process that helps us help the worker develop some ways in which to deal with it. For example, if the worker sees that really the client was sending a message and the worker was missing it, maybe the worker identified with the teenagers in the family and lost track of the angry father so that the father felt the worker was on the side of the kids. Well, that's a mistake. It'll come out in this little 2-page process thing. So then maybe the worker practices with the supervisor to go back the next week and say to that father, can we start again? I think I wasn't really fully understanding how hard this problem with your son is hitting you. That would be great practice. In fact, I want to say it right across the board. Good practice is shortening the distance between when a worker makes a mistake with a client and when they catch it. I think the same is true with the supervisor. The supervisor who comes back the second week and said, when you brought that problem to my attention, I don't think I fully understood how hard it was hitting you. Let's go back to it. That supervisor is modeling the kind of practice I want to see the worker use when they work with clients.
And we're supposed to make mistakes. That's why we have supervision, right?
Well, I call it when I have students present. I always have students present their process in my classes when I teach. I present theory, etc. I'm not teaching now, but my workshops, for example, they will use what I call memory work. Memory work means they don't have something in writing, but they go back and try to recall from memory what the process was like. And sometimes they'll say something, and I'll say to them, "Wow, that was a great mistake." And they'll look at me and their mouth drops open. Why was that a great mistake? Because you were being spontaneous. You responded from the gut. You weren't being mechanical and saying what you thought the book or your class taught you to say. You weren't saying things like, I hear you saying that, and then going on with some kind of a intellectual comment. You were being real. Now, you were off base, but the good mistake was the fact that you were being real. Now go back and apologize for it to the client. Now, when people learn from mistakes like that, they go on to be more effective practitioners, and they make, in my view, better and more sophisticated mistakes. It's our entire practice life. It doesn't end just because we got a license. So I hope that's clear. Learning from mistakes is the way in which I think good supervision takes place. Of course, you have to make the supervisee feel safe and feel respected and not feel criticized because they missed something.
That is really wonderful. That was really excellent. Thank you so much for that. Is there anything that I didn't ask you today that you feel is important for people to know about?
Well, I guess, the context in which this conversation is taking place. As I said, I was on a Zoom meeting with managers. I won't go into which association it was, but there's an association. And this was the first meeting. And people were talking about what it was like to be managers in this time. And it was really, really difficult. So I think you did ask me about it, but I just want to underline it. You cannot be helping to other people unless you get the same kind of help yourself. And that's what I tried to say to the managers today, that their support of each other was crucial. That they couldn't just think about their staff and their workers and their clients. They got to think about themselves as well. So I think at another time, we might have been able to spend more time on how to deal with some of the major issues that these managers and agencies and supervisors are facing. When people are not coming into work. Child welfare, for example, is a good example. I'm on the child welfare board. I volunteer to be on the board. It's a Department of Children, Youth, and Families, and we meet once a month. So I have some pretty close information on what's happening in child welfare in New Hampshire. It's terrible. It was terrible before. Workers having huge caseloads, 40, for example. Well, a caseload of 40 for an investigator is too high. They're not going to be able to do the job. Now imagine what happens when these kids are not going to school. No one is at the school who can pick up the problems. For example, teachers, social workers, psychologists, and call child welfare. The child welfare workers are not able to go and visit the homes themselves. There is clear evidence that domestic violence and child sexual abuse is increasing in homes where kids are sent home and the whole family is under stress. And at the same time, in this state where I live right now, funding is being cut back for child welfare. Well, that's outrageous. So as a social worker, I feel I need to do things. I've written 2 columns already for our Concord Monitor newspaper. I'm going to write some more. We have to make sure that people do not lose their attention to the most vulnerable kids and families, because all of the families are feeling vulnerable. So I guess you've really asked the questions that I think are crucial. I just wanted to get that little plug in at the end, because I think every one of us as a social worker has a responsibility to paying attention to the at-risk kids who are going to be left out because everyone is feeling at risk.
And that could be very stressful on the workers. We're the helpers. So this is another current issue with the COVID virus that is affecting the stress level as us social workers. And again, we need supervision for that as well.
Supervision, support groups, opportunities. Maybe a good supervisor brings together the workers for a meeting and takes an hour out, if it's possible, to meet. Otherwise, they have to do it online, and to talk to each other about how this is affecting our lives. I'm not saying turning it into a therapeutic encounter. Supervision is not psychotherapy or clinical practice. Supervision is supervision. But the process of developing a working relationship, the importance of empathy and confrontation when necessary, the ability of people who are struggling with similar issues like workers to help each other, that's pretty powerful. I think we need that now much more than we've ever needed it in the past. And I have my fingers crossed, because I don't know how things are going to work out in the next number of months. I don't think anybody does.
I agree. So how can my audience learn more about your work, either online or in print?
There's a number of ways. I have a textbook on practice. It's now in its 8th edition. That's called The Skills of Helping Individuals, Family Groups, and Communities. And it's been used in schools of social work since the late 70s. And it is an 8th edition. So there's a chance some of your listeners have actually used it in their class. So if they did, yes, that's me. I'm the Lawrence Shulman who wrote that book you used, right? There's also a 4th edition of my book, Interaction with Supervision, which will be published, probably it will be out this summer, by NASW. 3rd edition has been around for a while. I decided to update it. I just actually finished working on it. So I'm assuming that's going to be available this summer.
And all of that information will be on therapyshow.com. So Dr. Shulman, on behalf of myself, my listeners, and all of the people that you have helped through your work, I want to thank you for your contributions to mental health treatment. and for taking the time out of your busy schedule to help me and my audience better understand supervision's best practices.
Thank you for those nice comments, your kind comments, but also I want to thank you for providing this podcast and the whole series of podcasts. That also makes, I think, a very important contribution to mental health treatment. And so please keep it up.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. So be sure to check out my website, therapyshow.com, which has many resources about mental health. There you will also find how to submit questions, stories, or insights that you have about the mental health system, or suggestions about who else I can interview and how I can improve the show. I'd like to close by reminding our listeners to please subscribe, share, and review this podcast so you, someone you love, and people around the world can gain more benefit from therapy. There is no need to suffer in silence. Get the help that you need to create the life that you want.